We are here to talk about Russia's place on the international stage and what that means for Germany, for Europe, for the U.S., but also for Japan and Asia. A real, I think, inflection point in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Just on Monday, Donald Trump had his latest phone call with Vladimir Putin, and he appears to have essentially abandoned his efforts to try to find a way out of the war. He spent about 2 months trying to get Putin to accept the U.S. plan for a ceasefire. Russia basically told him no, and Trump essentially seems to have said, well, okay, all right, and I'll let other people sort it out. And so we are at a point where Russia is at maybe its strongest position since the war began. The U.S. seems less interested in doing anything to support Ukraine or to end the war. Europe and Ukraine's other are really struggling to work out what to do. So Sasha, I'd like to start with you. How did we get to this point in the war, and to what extent has this really confirmed that Putin has the upper hand? For the last 3 years, he's been on this strategy of basically believing, thinking, and may have been vindicated in this. How did we get here, and what do you think this current inflection point means for where it goes next?
Couple of points. I think that Putin's war optimism for now is very hard to miss. And I think that I agree with you, Max, that he believes that time is on his side. He has a very strong manpower advantage. He has a very strong material advantage in availability of munitions, tanks, on all of these metrics. He definitely stands bigger than the Ukrainian armed forces. And he believes that over 3+ years of the war, the West and Ukraine have unleashed against Russia everything what they had in their stash. And then he has absorbed all of these punches, pulled these punches. You don't want to be in pain contest with Russia and with Vladimir Putin. And with that, he believes that really time is on his side. And his confidence is based partly on the objective reality, partly, which we never should exclude, on the quality of information that he receives. And that can be questionable. As we all know, the Russian system is based on lying, so the more detached you are from where the center of action is, the more inaccurate the information can be. So what his top military advisor, General Valery Gerasimov, is telling him might not necessarily entirely reflect the battlefield dynamics, but this fuels his sense of war optimism. With that, pushing Ukrainians hard on the battlefield remains his major point of leverage. If he accepts the Ukrainian-European idea of ceasefire, which also originates from Trump, who's not very attuned to the details maybe, then you remove this pressure from the Ukrainians. You give them 30 days at least of breathing space to, regroup, rearm, move around equipment, probably create facts on the ground by introducing European reassurance force, whatever it is. And then Ukrainians at the negotiation table can be stubborn and say, the only acceptable resolution is that you, Russia, go back to your territory and we regain our internationally recognized borders of 1991, including Crimea, and you pay reparations, and you, Mr. Putin, go to The Hague to be tried as a war criminal. All legitimate requests, by the way. So with that, Putin will have to restart the war and be even an uglier bad boy than he is now. So I think he can see through that. He will not give Ukrainians this operational pause. And then the normal practice for conflicts of this intensity is that negotiations go hand in hand with the fighting. For example, the war on Korean Peninsula that this war between Russia and Ukraine is frequently compared with, for the last 2 years of the war, the negotiations were conducted with multiple rounds. Bulk of American casualties falls on the last year, and then at some point both sides get exhausted, and then there is a resolution, which is not mutually necessarily accommodating, but something that both sides can live with. So here we are not in the territory where both sides are exhausted yet. Their visions of what the outcome should be is still miles apart. The Russians believe that they have an advantage. Ukrainians believe that with Western help, they can wear Russians down. And I think that that explains Vladimir Putin's logic. He might be wrong, by the way. Ukraine and its Western enablers and allies have a lot of agency to really bring about the moment at some point where further throwing bodies on the war and equipment and so on might have diminishing returns for the Russians, where Mr. Putin will finally face the challenge: do I continue the war, or do I risk undermining my own system and grip of power? But my estimate is that we are months and months away from this point, so it will require a lot of patience, blood, sweat, and tears from Ukrainian side and also from the Western supporters to reach that point, but we are not there yet.
So speaking of those Western supporters, Sabine, I'd like to bring you in. We have a new government in Germany, and Chancellor Merz is much more active than his predecessor in trying to support Ukraine and to counteract Russia. But he's doing this at maybe Europe's weakest point during the war, when the focus of the Europeans has been just to do what they can to try to keep the U.S. involved. And my colleagues at the FT and other media have reported that after Trump spoke to Putin, they had what sounded like a very fraught call with Trump, the European leaders, and Zelensky, where Trump seems to have basically said, well, Putin's winning, and this is harder than I thought, and I guess there's not really much we could do about it. Why don't you guys sort it out? Okay, thanks, bye. Where does this leave Germany and Ukraine's other European allies, and how are they going to try to keep the U.S. engaged and to hold Russia back?
So thank you, Max, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm very happy. So yes, I mean, we have a new government, and I mean, I would still like to stress that the previous government is the government of, or was the government of the Zeitenwende, so a lot has happened in Germany and with German policy towards Russia in this war, towards Ukraine, etc., over the past 3.5 years. But you're right. I mean, Germany has been absent for some time, also from the strategic debate and from the strategic developments in the framework of Western policy with regard to this war. First, because there was a very, very deep and disabling coalition crisis that lasted for more than a year, and then because the previous coalition collapsed. And that was indeed a big problem for German foreign policy. So now we have a new government. It has been in office 2 weeks, I think. And I mean, I'll start with a small caveat, because this government too, it's a coalition. So a typical German thing, it's a coalition, and the foreign policy positions of the two coalition parties are not identical. The situation is slightly different from the previous coalition, but still we have foreign policy positions that do not match to 100%. It is not, I mean, we used to call CDU, SPD coalitions great coalitions. This is not a great coalition. They don't have an absolute majority in parliament, so they operate in a very different political context, and this political context, the domestic context in Germany, remains fragile. I think we have to be very realistic about this. It remains fragile. Now, you mentioned the disruption of the transatlantic relationship, and indeed, specifically also for this coalition, and especially for the Christian Democratic Union, this is a huge problem. And not only regarding the policy towards and in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, it's basically a huge problem because transatlantic relations since World War II have been the key pillar of German foreign policy. So we are going through a major transformation with regard to German foreign policy and the basic assumptions that German foreign policy used to be based on. And I think the sort of relationship between the previous government and especially Olaf Scholz and Joe Biden, it was probably the last example of a functioning and very close relationship between the chancellery here in Berlin and the White House in Washington. Now, if you look at the coalition treaty, I mean, I will start with that, it clearly identifies Russia as the biggest and most direct threat to German and European security. And it's interesting to see that Russia is mentioned exactly 3 times in the coalition treaty. Ukraine is mentioned 17 times. And the coalition treaty basically contains all the elements of support for Ukraine that already characterized the policy of the previous government that we can expect to continue. So from direct budget support, military support, security guarantees, although the language is a little bit vague here, so the principled support for NATO accession of Ukraine, the clear and resolved and decisive support for EU accession, and all that in close coordination with the partners, and this means especially the European partners. So I think this captures very well the approach that this government wants to take, and I would call this an approach of, say, cooperative leadership. Together with, when it comes to military support, and I think this was very visible over the past 3 to 4 weeks, together with the other countries in the coalition of the willing, but also in the larger European context. And I think the first steps that the government took and that the new chancellor took, so his first trips that brought him to Warsaw and Paris and then to Brussels, and then the joint trip that he took with Tusk, Starmer, and Macron to Kyiv, all this speaks of this government approach. Also the domestic steps that were taken, the change of the constitution, the suspension of the debt brake in order to make sure that more can be expensed for defense, etc. So these are all first steps. But there are certain caveats, I think. One is that indeed, as I said, the positions within the coalition are not identical. So the debate about weapon supplies will continue. I mean, Taurus, I think, is only sort of a container term for the supply of certain forms and types of weapons. I think we will have a very complicated debate, also in that vein, a very complicated debate about possible troop deployments. So the discussion about, however you want to call them, reinforcement troops or tripwire troops, that will be very, very difficult. What the government has to do, and I think there is a strong awareness now, but it has to be implemented, it has to be realized, it has to move away from the dependence of the US towards a more autonomous policy and stance, while at the same time, and again I think there is a consensus within government, while at the same time preserve what can be preserved of the transatlantic relationship. This is perhaps the biggest gap that this government has to bridge. And I think it's really a very, very, very complicated, it will be a very complicated process. And then I think, and this is my last point for now, I think we are still very weak in terms of strategic culture. And this concerns both defense, so the external dimension, but it also concerns the internal dimension, resilience against Russia's hybrid warfare against Germany. And if we look at how the relationship between Germany and Russia has changed since 2022, I mean, Germany is one of the most unfriendly countries now from a Russian perspective. I think it's probably the main target of Russian hybrid warfare within Europe for a number of reasons. And the latest situation, the situation that we have now with the change of course in Washington, is that Europe is actually the main enemy from a Russian perspective. So this reinforces the hostility in Russia vis-à-vis Germany. So these are the challenges I think we face. And yeah, after 2 weeks, it's a little bit early to make an assessment of how the government faces or manages those challenges. But yeah, this is what we will have to watch in the coming months and years.
Yes, we don't have headsets for everyone. Yuichi, I'd like to bring you in because something I think that we'd very much like to be one of the focal points of this panel is that Japan and not only Japan but Asia are in many ways just as directly affected by the war in Ukraine as European countries have been, and Japan is a very interesting case because Japan has, despite still not having a formal peace treaty to end the Second World War, there's the ongoing dispute over the northern territories, the Kuril Islands that are still occupied by Russia. But Japan really made enormous efforts to engage with Russia, particularly under Shinzo Abe. And now Japan has been lumped in by Russia with what Russia calls the unfriendly countries, all of the countries that have joined the Western sanctions campaign. So I was hoping that you could just give us a view here into when we're at this very difficult moment in the war for Ukraine and its allies. How is Japan looking at what's going on, and how does Tokyo feel about this sort of this resurgent triumphalist direction that Russia is taking?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Max, for this question, and also Sasha, thank you very much for organizing this event, terrific event. Thank you for the question. I think first of all, Asia occupies a very important place in President Putin's foreign policy, and Japan is no exception to that. And the Japanese role in the international politics regarding with the current Russian war in Ukraine is quite unique for some reasons. Number one, Japanese approach to Russia has been quite ambivalent and also quite mixed. Japan has been pursuing a quite mixed approach to Russia, of course. There are some commonality with German approach, but still Japan has some particular reasons why that country is pursuing a quite mixed approach. Number one, Japan doesn't have a peace treaty with Russia after the end of the Second World War. So Prime Minister Abe was particularly eager to try to conclude the peace treaties with Russia, as Shinzo Abe was eager to clear all the burden that Japan has had in the Second World War. By creating a peace treaty with Russia, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe thought that Japan finally ends a kind of the post-war era. So in this way, I think that Prime Minister Abe has spent a huge energy in trying to create a quite friendly relationship with Russia. And actually, he met with President Putin 27 times, and he visited Russia 11 times. So among all the Western leaders, except for perhaps Angela Merkel, I think Prime Minister Abe knew President Putin very well. Soon after Prime Minister Abe came back from Florida, Mar-a-Lago, in his first summit meeting with President Donald Trump in 2017, I had the chance to have the dinner with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and I asked him quite a straightforward question: what did you talk with Donald Trump? And Donald Trump repeatedly asked the personality of President Putin and how to deal with President Putin, because Donald Trump at the time was quite nervous about how to approach to Putin. he didn't know President Putin very well. But among all the Western leaders, except for Angela Merkel, as I mentioned, Donald Trump thought that Shinzo Abe was the most experienced Western leader who knew very much about President Putin. So actually, Shinzo Abe was a kind of a teacher to Donald Trump, how to approach to President Putin. But at the same time, after a Russian forceful annexation, illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, Japan began to criticize and put sanctions upon Russia. So we can see the gap between Prime Minister's office approach to Putin and Foreign Ministry approach to Putin. Foreign Ministry has been much more critical to Russian violation of international law. So in the national security strategy, which National Secretary Ant created in 2013, in which I joined in drafting a part of the document, it is written in regard to Russia, I quote, under the increasingly severe security environment in East Asia, it is critical for Japan to advance cooperation with Russia in all areas, including security and energy, thereby enhancing bilateral relations as a whole in order to ensure its security. Based on this recognition, Japan will cooperate with Russia in securing peace and the stability of the Asia-Pacific region, unquote. So it's clear that Japan was trying to create a strategic partnership with Russia under the leadership of Prime Minister Abe. And actually, Japan created 2+2 meeting with Russia, foreign minister, defense minister meeting with Russia. So among all the Western countries, I think that Japan was in a leading position to try to be close to President Putin, try to be friendly with President Putin. So in 2019, you can see quite a funny picture. I don't know why it happened, but in a very small table like this, Prime Minister Abe was sitting at the center, and beside, you can see the face of Donald Trump, President Putin, and President Xi. It was 2019. So Abe was playing a quite exceptional role in creating a kind of solidarity in the international community. But after his death, no Western leader could succeed in doing this. Of course, after 2022, it became much more difficult for anybody to create the solidarity in the international community. But at the same time, as I mentioned, Japanese foreign ministry has been much more critical to what Russia has been doing. Like we can see it in a foreign minister the statement soon after the Crimea referendum in March 2014. It is written, it is stated by Japanese foreign minister that with the referendum in the autonomous Republic of Crimea, Ukraine violates the constitution of Ukraine. It is no legal effect and Japan does not recognize the outcome. Japan deplores that Russia has recognized independence of the autonomous Republic of Crimea, which infringes on unity, sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Japan can never overlook an attempt to change the status quo with force in the background, unquote. So you can see that while Prime Minister Abe has been creating a very close, friendly relationship with President Putin, but Japanese foreign ministry has been sided with international community, particularly other G7 countries, to try to criticize and put very strict sanction upon Russia. So Japan has been pursuing a kind of two-track approach or mixed approach to Russia. And this can be even seen in Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's recent speech at the National Diet on January 24th this year. Ishiba mentioned that, quote, "We will continue to strongly support Ukraine and enforce sanctions against Russia," unquote. Japan is the fifth largest country, country providing support to Ukraine, financial support to Ukraine, after the United States, Germany, UK, and France. among all the Asian countries, Japan is particularly important in supporting Ukraine. And also Japan has been linking European theater with Asian theater. So in this regard, I think that Japan has been playing a very important role. But at the same time, Prime Minister Ishiba also mentioned in his speech, the same speech that, quote, although Japan-Russia relations remains in a difficult situation, Japan firmly maintains its policy of resolving the territorial issues and concluding a peace treaty, unquote. So Japan still continually pursuing a kind of a mixed two-track approach to Russia. I think this is important to understand that the Japanese vision for the international order is both quite inclusive and pluralistic to try to adapt to a new reality where the BRICS is more powerful and the global south countries is playing a much larger roles. In this way, I think that the Japanese approach to Russia is different from some other Western countries, but still, there is a difficulty for Japan to pursuing this. But I'd like to end my remark by saying that Prime Minister Kishida played a really important role after 2022 in joining the international community, particularly Western countries, in sanctioning Russia, because in 2014, Kishida was foreign minister. He saw it. He saw the violation of Russia by annexing Crimea. And he was in a leading position with the Japanese government in sanctioning Russia. So there is a gap between Foreign Minister Kishida's approach and Prime Minister Abe's approach in 2014. And in 2022, Kishida was a Prime Minister of Japan. That's why Japan actually stepped up its position to try to put a much stronger sanction towards Russia.
Thanks. So Sasha, I'd like to go back to you because there was an interesting point that I think is very applicable to the broader issue of what happens between Russia and America at this point of the war, which is the sort of dual engagement and pursuit of trade. If you think back to Monday, or when Trump made his social media post announcing his call with Putin, he had a long spiel about we will be discussing ways to stop the bloodbath in Ukraine, and he seems to love this word, bloodbath and trade. And you look at this and you think, these are two things that don't really go together. And how can you have trade without solving the war in Ukraine, which they have admitted that they haven't really made much progress in solving at all. But something that Russia does seem to have been successful in is pursuing this dual track of engagement. In talks with the U.S., Ukraine is actually just one part of the broader track of restoring Russia-U.S. bilateral. There are lots of talks about things like rare minerals and reviving the Nord Stream pipeline with U.S. involvement, and the rhetorical shift from Russia has also been pretty remarkable. There was, I think, a very important interview with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, who spent I can't even remember how long going on about how the U.S. is the root. And then a couple months ago, he said, actually, the U.S., not that bad. It's Europe that has been the cause of all the problems in the world for the last 500 years. And you're seeing the U.S. portrayed in a much more positive light in Russian state media. And, this idea of engagement, even as there is no progress in peace talks, why has Russia been pursuing this? Why has this been successful? They found a very receptive partner in the Trump administration. And how possible do you think it is that they could actually make progress on this without any progress on a ceasefire in Ukraine?
A disclaimer, I don't have a crystal ball that reads into Trump's mind. That was probably somewhere there in the Moscow Carnegie office, but we were kicked out by the Kremlin, and it's probably somewhere in the storage, but we cannot find it. So we won't read into Trump's mind and into Putin's mind by extension as well. But I can tell you this. I think that there is a beautiful American world in diplomacy, compartmentalization. And the Russians usually hated that word because our approach to foreign policy is more holistic. Like, tell me what our relationship status is. and then we will define that. This kind of friends with benefits and so on, like it's somewhat foreign. And then in terms of great power relationship with America, we want to understand, are we partners or are we adversaries or what is there? And then working on specific issues, like Russians know how to do it, but that's not the approach that they feel comfortable with. What happened under Biden is that initially Biden arrived with this very compartmentalized approach, and Putin decided to go to war in Ukraine because he thought that he can win much more. War in Ukraine became the organizing principle of American approach in dealing with Russia. No matter whether you're talking arms control, trade, regional crisis like Iran, dealing in the Arctic, any compartment you will open, there will be Secretary Blinken popping up and telling the Russians, stop invading sovereign Ukraine, get back to your territory, then we might talk about arms control. You remember that the talks that led in Geneva by Sergei Ryabkov, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Wendy Sherman, then Deputy Secretary, have been suspended, and the war became the organizing principle. And that's where the Americans really took the lead of coalition to push back against Russian aggression. I think now the Russians discovered the beauty of compartmentalization, because if you can restore this framework and then Ukrainian war becomes just one of the compartments, you can continue to disagree in that compartment. But then everything else can be on track and you have a much more robust relationship where the US has stake. And for some reason, and again, sorry for not taking the crystal ball with me, Donald Trump has accepted and embraced this approach. And then we have in parallel talks about normalization of diplomatic relationship, you know, embassy property, everything what happened after Crimea annexation is back on the agenda. We have this very miraculous and interesting economic discussions we will come in a second to. And then you have also regional crises like Iranian nuclear program or Houthis, where President Trump believes that Russia can be of help and you need to engage Russia because it will bring something to the table. And I think that the understanding in the Kremlin might be that President Trump presents a generational opportunity for Russia's foreign policy to try to normalize the relationship over the last 3+ years that President Trump remains in office. Well, he's musing about the third term. We'll watch that space closely. Color me skeptical, but nevertheless. And then the amount of disruption that Trump's presidency might instill into transatlantic relationship, what Sabine has mentioned, is a natural gift. You pocket that. You pocket all of the Trump rhetoric about maybe we can recognize Crimea and maybe we can reach an amicable agreement. So that's already a given. And then exploit all the opportunities that come your way. Removal of American sanctions remains a shiny object that Russians very much want. It's difficult to do because when leaving the White House, Biden administration managed to package a lot of executive orders that Biden has issued into CATSA, Countering American Adversaries for Sanctions Act, that was passed in 2018 by the Congress as a reaction to Trump's press conference with Putin in Helsinki during the one bilateral summit. So removal of sanctions is elusive, but then restoring some normalcy in the relationship, offering Trump projects, is something where Russia hopes to weaken the sanctions regime, to generate cash flows, maybe if American companies can be persuaded to go back. For example, why wouldn't ExxonMobil go to work on Sakhalin, right? That's something that if it materializes, sends a signal to others to come back, and that's beneficial. And then if you can find deals, and like a very useful source is the Financial Times that reports on some of these issues very accurately, probably, that there might be personal interests of people close to President Trump and his family in this universe that the Russians try to incentivize by.
I think with Steve Witkoff, the special envoy for the U.S., the phrase that he likes is very compelling commercial opportunities. It sounds like really that Russia is pursuing two things that just aren't very compatible at the same time, which is to use this kind of unique opportunity of Trump to try to rebuild relations with the U.S. and do what they can to help dismantle the transatlantic order, while also basically rejecting Trump's mediation efforts and pursuing what looks like Putin is very bent on securing a victory in the war. Do you think at some point they will have to choose between whichever of these is more dear to Putin's heart, or are they just going to keep having their cake and eating it as long as they can?
I think that you point to a very right dilemma. I see my colleague Alexander Baunov, who has just written a piece a week ago about that precise dilemma on Carnegie Politica. I urge for those who have not read it, read it, because it's a very articulate explanation of that particular dilemma. I think it depends on a couple of things. And again, sorry for not having a crystal ball. We don't know how much President Trump is actually or will remain invested into the idea of ceasefire and resolving this war. If he's not, and if he says, I did already something very big, that both started to talk again. That was not the case. They are in one room. That's a big achievement. This war would never happen if he would be president and all of the talking points. But then they're talking. My job is done. I'm walking away, washing my hands off. And then this walking away and how that's structured, whether he prohibits to sell to Ukraine stuff that the U.S. provides, Patriot missiles, spare parts for the equipment that has already been supplied, or it's available for Ukraine but needs to be purchased by somebody else. It's a big difference. But then he walks away and goes to restore ties with Russia because he believes that Russia is instrumental for his agenda. And then there is this issue of reverse Kissinger, like driving a wedge between Russia and China because China is the peer competitor and you want to draw Russia from Chinese firm embrace, either into neutral position or into your America's camp. I think that if that's the carrot, Vladimir Putin is happy to wave this carrot in front of the administration's nose as long as he can, because that withdraws the possibility of Trump becoming Biden on steroids, making Russia's aggression against Ukraine, again, the organizing principle of American foreign policy towards Russia, getting very bitter, and finding these tools of pressure and coercion that are there in American toolkit. America can hurt Russia much more than it's hurting now. It's just that Trump is not doing that for various reasons. So if you can avoid it by, being somewhat engaged in the diplomatic process, offering these commercial opportunities that Steve Witkoff has talked about, and demonstrate tremendous respect towards Trump, the 3+ years that you have is just a terrific gift for Russia strategically.
Very briefly, and then I want to move on. But you made you said earlier that Russia seems to think that they've rolled with pretty much all the punches that the U.S., Europe, and Ukraine can give in terms of ways to really hurt Russia. But you've just alluded to things that Trump could be doing to hurt Russia that he hasn't done yet. Zelensky has been pushing very hard recently for the U.S. to do this if Russia rejects the ceasefire. Just very quickly, what do you think those are? What do they have left in the toolbox that they haven't used?
I think that even restoring the U.S. level of support and sanction maintenance to Biden level would put pressure on, just doing what the U.S. has been doing before, number one. Number two, supplying more weapons to Ukraine doesn't win the war in itself. ATACMS are helpful, but they are not crucial and so on. So in the war of attrition, you really need to supply resources to the weaker side and then wear the stronger side down. That will lead to a deal that is acceptable to Ukraine. And that's unfortunately, I think that it's an emerging consensus, and it's possible to say that it will be not the ideal and just deal with Ukraine regaining its control over its internationally recognized territory, including Crimea, but that's a deal that keeps Ukraine as a sovereign country, independent from Russia, anchored in Western institutions, and as a viable state with viable economy that can get its reconstruction. So providing more weapons is helpful, and then increasing sanction pressure is possible. I don't think that the maximalist approach that, we can simply take 7 million barrels that Russia pumps into the global market and it will not hurt anybody. I think that's fantasy land. But you can do a lot to increase the transactional costs for running the shadow fleet and transactions and so on. And you can enhance enforcement. And I think that's also the side effect of everything what Elon Musk and Dodge have done to the civil service, that attacks on treasury, on intelligence community, just reduce the bandwidth for the US state machinery to enforce the sanctions. And you hear a lot of circumstantial evidence that it's much easier to circumvent sanctions precisely because the watchful eye, the Sauron's eye of American sanctions machinery, to pull Tolkien again, is not focused on Russia as it used to be.
So Yuichi, coming back to you, I wanted you to pick up on another point that Sasha referred to, which is the idea that a lot of people in the Trump administration have been talking about since they came into the office of doing some sort of reverse Nixon, because the Trump administration, they've decided the U.S.'s biggest strategic adversary is China, and they think that they could somehow peel Russia off from China to break what Putin and Xi have tried to portray, including in Moscow just recently, as this unshakable partnership between the countries. You know, from the Asian perspective, how likely do you think it is that they could do that? And if the U.S. is at least going to try, what would that mean for the broader situation in Asia?
Well, thank you very much for that question. That idea, I mean, the reverse Nixon and reverse Kissinger idea, is particularly popular among Southern circle in Japanese foreign policy community, particularly Russian experts. This was, I consider, one of the biggest reasons why Prime Minister Abe was trying to be very close to Russia. I mean, the fear of expanding Chinese military power. But at the same time, it's also quite interesting to know that at that time, I remember that Russian side was also quite eager to be closer to Japan. Maybe many for two reasons. Number one, to try to divide or split US-Japan alliance. Of course, this is number one priority. But the number two priority is to diversify Russian foreign relations or security partnership with as many countries as possible, including Japan. As long as Japan can be an independent player, maybe Japan can be a useful tool for Russia to expand its influence there. But many Japanese experts, officials, don't believe in the idea of the reverse Kissinger, reverse Nixon, because as quite famous scholar Alexander Gabuev wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine that it is quite hard to split the two. I believe in that argument because maybe another reason, because number one priority for China is, of course, Taiwan. And Ukraine is not at all number one priority for Chinese foreign policy. To unite Taiwan with the mainland, it is essential to have Russia at its side, because Russia is the United Nations Security Council member. So Russia would not be isolated when China invaded Taiwan within the United Nations Security Council. As long as Taiwan remains the number one priority for China, I think that always Xi Jinping, China, need to rely upon Russian goodwill. And Putin has been showing always goodwill to China on these issues. So in this way, I think that Russia can be a very useful tool for Chinese leaders. When China decide to invade Taiwan, in this way, I think that it always remains very strong, between China and Russia in its cooperation alignment for this reason.
No, I think you're right that absolutely every time that there's an opportunity for Russia to move closer to or further away from China, really since he came to power, they've chosen China every time. It's been very consistent. And then on the same topic of engagements, Sabine, going back to you, this is something that in the last few months has also become discussed more in Europe, and it's not just in countries like Hungary and Slovakia, where you have these pretty much openly pro-Russian leaders, but even here in Germany, this has been more of a topic because Germany, as we all know, this is the other country where the term Putin-Versteher comes from. This is where you had people like Gerhard Schröder and Matthias Warnig who made decades of efforts to deepen Germany's ties with and reliance on Russia. Something that it's now paying for very dearly, as all of you who pay energy bills in Berlin will know. And recently, you have seen coming out of the woodwork in Germany quite a few prominent people express the idea that maybe we should turn the Zeitenwende back. Maybe it might not even be such a bad idea to start buying energy from Russia again. And this was enough of an issue that it was even something that came up when they were discussing the coalition agreement. The EU made a statement last week that they might feel the need to even ban imports of Russian energy by 2027. So how significant is this constituency for re-engagement with Russia in Europe? And if Russia and the US continue successfully on the track that they are on, do you think that constituency in Europe and here in Germany would become stronger?
Okay, thank you very much. That's an excellent question. Just one short note. I think the EU discussion about banning or sort of preventing the possibility to reactivate Nord Stream 2. I think this is more a reaction to the moves that have been recently made by the Trump administration. It's not so much Germany, but of course it resonates in the German discourse. Before I answer your question, can I go back to something Sasha said? Because I would like to briefly react to that. Thank you. So I think you phrased that really brilliantly. So now Russia has discovered the beauty of compartmentalization, and that's totally true. I just don't really think that the sort of, the sequence started with Russia. I think this was already a reaction to how they assessed Trump's personality and also potential politics. And in that, I mean, the Ukrainian side showed a very, very similar reaction already last year. I mean, if you look at the so-called victory plan that Volodymyr Zelensky presented in the US and in Europe in September and October 2024, there was one point that basically started the whole discussion about the minerals deal, because the Ukrainians understood that Trump sees himself as this deal maker. Now, the way the Russian side uses this, I think, is deliberately to deliberately broaden the agenda in order to diminish the meaning and the significance of Ukraine. So this is exactly what you described. And I think on the American side, the problem is that, like, really ending the war, I'm not even speaking of ending the war in a sustainable way, but ending the shooting, let's put it like this, is actually not the first priority of Trump and his administration. The first priority is the normalization of the relationship with Russia. And I would be interested if you agree with that, but that would be my observation. And then there's another issue here, I think, and again, I would be very interested in hearing your views. I think what we see now is not Putin-Trump 1.0. It's not 2016-17. In 2016-17, I think many in Moscow believed that Trump's election could actually lead to some kind of great power condominium for a broader agreement on European security that then also would solve, from the Russian perspective, the Ukraine problem, etc. I think now people in the Kremlin see themselves a lot further on the way to this post-Western multipolar world. And Trump has a very instrumental position, on that trajectory. So this is, I don't really see a great interest in a real partnership in the Kremlin. I think it's more like Trump as the terminator of the West and then we move on. Yeah, so I would be really interested to hear.
Two
Yeah,
fingers, just while we are on, and then I think that I'm very curious to
Sorry,
hear
I
what
didn't
you,
want to-
what you say about the Putin-Versteher and kind of business community Putin-Versteher here. 2 points. On this kind of normalization of relationship with Russia is the goal. I agree. I think that Trump understands how impossible it will be, even with such a president like him, and even with his grip on Republican Party, to start this process in kind of broad terms and ignore war in Ukraine without some form of resolution. You see what Lindsey Graham is doing. We might not attach to big importance, but Putin is deeply unpopular. And if you look at the poll, even among members of the Republican Party, there is not that much sympathy to what Russia is doing. So just ignoring it completely, cutting Ukraine loose in terms of military supplies, and then pivoting to normalizing ties with Russia is impossible.
It's still the only really bipartisan issue in Washington. You know, Lindsey Graham's bill, as of yesterday, to ramp up sanctions on Russia had 81 co-sponsors. A reminder, there are only 100 senators, so that really is almost the entire Senate is behind those.
Yeah.
So Katza was the same.
Yeah, so I think that really requires some form of resolution in order to embark on this policy. And then to your second point, I totally agree. And I don't think that what you are saying is in contradiction, because he wants to build a partnership with the US in a post-US dominated world, in where the US is a big kid on the block in Western Hemisphere, annex Greenland. Perfect. That's great, because it legitimizes annexation. You can have Greenland, I can have Crimea and chunk of Ukraine, Xi Jinping has Taiwan, and we all live happily together.
And this really goes back to what he said after Crimea, when he gave the first of many long televised historical rants, and where he talked a lot about the Iraq War, and the message was basically, well, if you did that, why can't I do this? You know, aren't we all equal here? But question for all of you really is, so you don't think that the idea that the Russians have tried to sell to the U.S. that, you know, if we can, you know, solve Ukraine, there are lots of other areas we can cooperate, not just on some sort of weird economic deals, but on Iran, they've offered support there. China, obviously, the U.S. sees an opportunity. You don't think that for Russia that's really part of some sort of bigger order? That's just something that is as transactional as the rest, because that's how they view the U.S. administration, as, you know, a very transactional group of people.
And I think that some of that are just ploys and carrots to wave. Like, I see no way, and I agree with Hosoya-san, that Russia will not abandon its partnership with China. Because for the next 10 plus years that Putin plans to be in charge in the Kremlin, the name of his Chinese counterpart will likely be Xi Jinping, and the structure ruling his giant Chinese neighbor will be the Communist Party. That's a given. If Trump will be in the White House in 28, that's highly dubious. What will happen to Trump's ability to be this powerful leader of executive branch after the midterms? God knows. So you need to exploit this interest, show so many avenues of where you would be useful to Trump's agenda in order to keep Trump close, while he is fracturing the transatlantic commitment, and all of the questions about the German, you know, Putin-Versteher pop up in all seriousness.
Yeah, I would agree to that. I think it's transactional, and it's one of the ways in which the Kremlin is trying to manipulate the Trump administration and the MAGA camp. Anyway, you wanted me to talk about Putin-Versteher. It's my favorite topic. So I'll say a few words about that. Yeah, so I mean, I think I would like to start by really stressing that the full-scale invasion has brought a Zeitenwende to the German perception of and perspective of Russia and Eastern Europe. And I think, you know, we need to discuss Putin-Versteher, but I think I would like to have this as a sort of background, because I really don't want to, that this is forgotten. So I think the general perception of Russia in the majority of the German population is indeed that Russia is an aggressive dictatorship and a huge threat, not only to Ukraine, but indeed to European security and beyond. And these are stable majorities, and they translate into majorities for support for Ukraine, including military support for Ukraine. Maybe also the fact that Boris Pistorius, who is in a way, if you like, the embodiment of Zeitenwende in the military sense, is and still is by far the most popular politician, and has been since he became Minister of Defense, the most popular politician in Germany. I think that also speaks to that. I think there's a consensus among the democratic political forces that this Russian threat needs to be contained, and this has led to the refocusing of German policy towards Eastern Europe from Russia to Ukraine and other countries in the neighborhood. And indeed, I mean, I think this really was a major change, you know, because before 2022, everything went through this Russia prism. So the neighboring country was seen through the Russia lens, and the priorities were quite different. I think that the Zeitenwende in 2022 followed a very long period of deterioration of the relationship. And this is also something that should not be forgotten. I think this period started with regard to Russian domestic politics and the hopes that, I mean, to my mind, quite unrealistically, but the hopes that were triggered by the Medvedev presidency in Germany, yeah, that this could now be a new start with Russia, that this so-called partnership for modernization could indeed have an impact on Russian internal developments, etc. So I think this flipped basically in 2011, 2012, the office swap, the rigged Duma elections, the mass protests, and then the suppression of the mass protests. That was a very important moment of disillusionment in Germany. And then, of course, with regard to external aggression, 2014 was another very important moment. Still, and this brings me closer to the Putin-Versteher, some basic assumptions on which Germany's policy towards Russia, towards Ukraine and others was based, they remained in place. And as a German, I have to say it really pains me to recognize, to acknowledge that it took the full-scale invasion to finally change that. So, on the challenge, or you know, I think the Putin-Versteher, I would like to just perhaps add a few nuances to this term. It's actually a painful term for me, but anyway. So I think there are different types of Putin-Versteher. Yeah? I think the most direct challenge really comes from the populist forces on, I mean, on the left, but much more on the right. And I would put the Union Sarah Wagenknecht rather in this category than on the left side of the political spectrum. And if you do the maths, then you can see that in the last federal election, they actually got, if you add the almost 5% that the Union Sarah Wagenknecht got, they got 25% of the vote. So this is one problem. And these forces are authoritarian, they are anti-European, they're anti-democratic, they're anti-liberal. They have very strong sympathies for Russian imperialism and autocracy. So they have a common agenda. And they're also partners of the Kremlin in Russia's hybrid war against Germany. So this is one category of Putin-Versteher. Then, even though we have the clear majorities that I just described, there are constituencies within some of the democratic parties, or in business, or elsewhere, who probably would prefer a different approach. And they have different reasons for these preferences. One is realpolitik considerations. So Russia is the great power, so we have to look to Russia. And then, so this is the typical realpolitik Russia prism that was very, very typical for German policy towards Russia and other countries in the past. They also believe that this conflict and this war can somehow be confined to Ukraine. So that a solution of the conflict and of the war within Ukraine, by basically forcing Ukraine into accepting the loss of control over certain parts of its territory, can somehow stop this. So it's really also a question of definition of this conflict and this war. And then there are some deeper traits of German political culture that also play a role here. This is the responsibility, or the sense of responsibility for the crimes against humanity and the wars of annihilation that Nazi Germany waged in Eastern Europe. Again, in German memory, very much focused on Russia, wrongly so, but very much focused on Russia during the Second World War. And flowing from that, this very strong sense of identity of a civilian power. Germany as a civilian power, this is something that built up in Germany after World War II. It's good that this happened, obviously, but there's a mismatch between the current security situation, the situation that we now have, and this reference to Germany as a civilian power during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So these are the three motivations, if you like, of this part of the Russlandversteher. Yeah, and because of what I just said about German identity as a civilian power and this very strong or this need, this whole process of coming to terms with the past, that has a lot, or the lack of strategic culture that I mentioned before, I think that also is rooted in these processes. So again, actually, very important processes and very important elements of German identity, but a clear mismatch with the current security situation that we're in. And the funny thing is, and I stop here, it's actually quite funny. European partners expect much more from Germany than Germany thinks that it is ready to give in terms of, for instance, cooperative leadership in the area of security, et cetera, et cetera. So German politicians, German society also, tends to be much more constrained and self-constrained. And European partners are very unhappy with that very often. So there's another mismatch for you, and I stop here.
Okay, so we've got about 23 minutes left, and I think it's time to go to questions. So we have some from those who are watching on YouTube as well, but I'd like to start with the room. If there's anyone who has a question, please put your hand up. Any questions from the audience, or should I go to YouTube? Yes, we got one back there. If you could state your name and affiliation as well, that would be great, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Anne Braun. I work with the German Foreign Office. Thank you so much for those very interesting presentations. And I just wanted to bring all the three elements a bit together in a question to Yuichi Hosoya. We heard from Sasha that there is this dual US approach and that normalization with Russia is going ahead kind of regardless of whether there's a real solution to the war in Ukraine. Then we hear from Sabine Fischer that the new government is determined to continue support for Ukraine and military build-up and push against Russia. And you said that there is this dual approach in Japan, supporting Ukraine, but also kind of trying to move towards a peace treaty with Russia. If there is a normalization in the US-Russia relations, kind of dropping of sanctions, economic re-engagement and so on, what do you think, where would Japan land then? Would it be closer to the European approach of continuing pushing against Russia, or would there be some kind of rethinking of the support for Ukraine. Thank you.
And just to expand briefly, because we have a question from YouTube much along the same lines, because it's Japan isn't the only country that would find itself in the situation. Korea is also a very good example, and I think quite a few other ostensibly pro-Western countries in Asia. So if you could give us the broader look, that would be really great.
Thank you, Barenji. Thank you. Thank you. That wonderful question. Let me answer in this way. First of all, Japan has been a much more independent international player than we usually assume. It means that in the first Abe's administration, first Trump administration, when the United States decided to abandon the CPTPP, Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister Abe decided to go forward without the United States. Also, Japan created the Quad framework because Japan at the time thought that the United States was reducing its international role. It means that it's better for Japan to encourage both India and Australia to play a larger role in international community by creating the Quad framework. So in this way, I think that it is quite indicative to see Japanese approach to the Trump's reciprocal taxation. When April the 2nd, Trump administration, President Trump announced the start of, at the Liberation Day, the start of the new Trump taxation. Japan's government, Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Ishiba talked two things. On one hand, Japan began a bilateral negotiation with the United States, and Japan was the first country to negotiate with Trump administration on the taxation. But at the same time, Prime Minister Ishiba also mentioned on the importance of defending post-war international order based on the rule of law. And Japan has been rejecting to the damage or the demise of the those rule-based international law. And that's why it's natural that the Prime Minister Ishiba criticized Trump's approach to seriously damage the post-war free trade system. In this way, I think that the Japanese approach is also two-track. On one hand, try to maintain and strengthen the alliance relationship with the United States because of the existence of China, Russia, and North Korea in East Asia. But at the same time, it's essential for Japan to defend the rule-based international order as Japan did in the first Trump administration. In this regard, Japan is much closer to Europe, I think.
Any more questions from the audience, or shall I go to YouTube? Do we have it? Yes, we got a hand up. Yes, gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Fujita. I work for the Embassy of Japan, and I'd like to thank all the panelists and the moderator for fruitful discussions. I have a question to Ms. Fischer. As someone who is following German security, domestic and foreign policies, and you talked about the differences of foreign policy among coalition parties. And the current administration decided to establish a National Security Council, and they say that they are going to hold the foreign policy outside MGUS, so coordinated foreign policy. And do you think there is some positive development with regard to the coordinating among parties about foreign policy when in comparison to the former administrations? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. So I think the idea of the National Security Council or the National Security and Defense Council that is being discussed, it's not an entirely new idea. The previous government actually had similar plans, which did not come through, mainly, in my view, because the Chancellery and the Federal Foreign Office were in different hands and couldn't really agree where this council should be affiliated to, right? So there was obviously a disagreement. This is different now. Chancellery and Federal Foreign Office are in the hands of one party, the CDU, with Chancellor and Minister being very close in their positions. So I think really because of this is my assumption because again it's 2 weeks, but I would assume that the internal workings of the government in this regard will be very different, and I think that opens much more space to actually implement this plan. So I'm really confident that this council will become a reality now. Also because, 2022 and the full-scale invasion was a huge shock, and as I said, it's very important to me to stress the changes that happened in Germany because of that shock. I think Trump's return to the White House and everything that happened afterwards is another shock of a very similar scale. So I think the changes within Germany will continue also in that respect. So I'm really confident that this is going to happen.
And so our next question is going to come to us all the way from Japan, I understand. So if we could go to the screen here. And I think yes, we can hear you.
Hi, I am Chisako Maso. I'm sorry, Hosoya Sensei, talking from your back. I'm attending from Fukuoka, Japan. Hi, Alex. It's been a while since I saw you last. I have 2 questions actually. Maybe you have touched upon those questions earlier part of your discussion. I had some technical issues, so I couldn't participate in the earlier half. But my questions are number one, how much do we have hope to keep the liberal economic order? And another question is how much why China has been so supportive to Russia. I understand that Putin is an issue, but Trump is also an issue, right? And there are voices, even in the Western world, that we should maintain a much better relationship with China in order to keep this liberal economy. And in China, their economy is also bad. So there are voices who want to maintain the traditional, good relationship between China and the Western world in terms of economy. However, Xi Jinping seems to be sacrificing this and somehow strengthening, actually, its relationship with Russia. To that extent, we have seen in the 3 joint statements published this month. People discuss that Russia is now a junior partner and China is bigger. But I think this doesn't really explain, because if China is bigger and greater power, then China doesn't have to be trapped by Russia's request, but actually it is. Why is China had been so supportive to Russia? Hosoya-san mentioned that China wants to unite Taiwan. But also, I think China seems to be also very afraid of its national security. And some people say that China had been manipulated by Putin. I don't know why. I wanted to hear the panelists' view. And back into the liberal economy, I also want to hear your opinion about this too. Thank you very much.
I'm happy.
I guess we're going to start with China.
I'm happy to take the China question and leave the liberal economy. I'm from Russia. I never lived in liberal economy. Couple of points. I don't think that the war was expected by China. The consensus in the Chinese government circles, the intelligence community and the expert community is that if you put up a list of upsides for Russia, even if it's successful in winning the war swiftly, and downsides, maybe Ukrainians will be hostile to Russia, and maybe they will not surrender and fight, and maybe, sanctions will be introduced, and just maybe Finland and Sweden will abandon their long-held neutrality and aspire to join NATO. Like, all of these downsides were obvious before the war started. That was so clear. So for rational, pragmatic Chinese, start of the war was absolutely unpalpable. And when it started, I think that it took everybody by surprise and added a personal element that Xi Jinping and Putin saw each other 3 weeks before the war, and Putin never fully explained to Xi what he is embarking on doing. But with that, China adapted. And I think that the key interest here is that China thinks also in counterfactuals. Imagine if Russia is defeated and that leads to regime change in Russia. And then Alexei Navalny, or whoever, Navalny was then alive, will be Russia's president who seeks Russia's security through deeper engagement with the West. Like, the major threat is not the horrible regime in Kiev, but maybe assertive China. And then the ways to secure Russia's territorial integrity and so on is to put American base in Vladivostok. So thinking in those counterfactuals means that China needs to do everything what's possible in order to keep this regime in place. And given the trajectory that the war has taken in 22, China was ready to go an extra mile to support Russia to at least keep in one place. If you remember, Dmitry Medvedev, who a lot of people don't treat seriously, but I don't think that he deserves that, traveled to China with a personal letter from President Putin in December 22. Xi Jinping came on a state visit in March, and that's where in custom statistics we see this uptick of dual-use goods, machine tools, and so on that help to prop Russia in. So that's one. Two, this asymmetrical relationship was all the time very beneficial for China. And access to cheap commodity resources, access to newer weapon designs after Crimea annexation, Russia as a showcase for Huawei, for use of Chinese yuan in international transactions, and so on, was all the time there. But that was happening at the time between Crimea annexation and full-scale invasion, where Russia still had 40% of its trade with the European Union. European Union was the largest investor and the largest provider of loans. With its illegal invasion of Ukraine, Russia has embarked on destroying this pillar of Russia's prosperity. And with that, China became the boss, like the major provider of all of these goods. And that made benefits and the notion of showcase as, if you have China as your partner, you can America-proof your economy, you can America-proof your business model. That became just a big advertisement. And now, with everything what Donald Trump is doing to the US economy with Liberation Day and so on, China is going around the world with those tools tested in Russia, saying, hey, if you're not sure about investing in US bond market, how about investing in R&D tools? If you are not sure about reliability of US equipment, how about Chinese equipment and so on? So that's also a very, very beneficial part. And then finally, access to Russian human capital. 400 Russian scholars who worked in Switzerland in this big Hadron Collider. Out of them, about a third, I think, ended up in China or are on their way because they were kicked out of Europe. So some of them have found ways to stay and find affiliation. Some of them went back to Russia. Some of them went to China. So with Russia ready to give access to its scholars, and then it's easy to neglect Russian science, but there are still pockets of excellence in applied physics, mathematics, algorithms, and so on that China can
Weapons
benefit.
design.
Right, weapons design as well, and then a lot of kind of hot from the battlefield Russian innovations in drone warfare and so on. It's definitely very beneficial for China. The price tag, and that's my final point, the price tag was worsening relationship with Europe, for sure, and that China tries to balance that in not overtly violating the sanctions and just doing everything below this threshold. But then China's expectation is that relationship with Europe would sour anyway because of Chinese industrial policy, concerns about IP, and so on. And then they all the time ask, why is Europe so vocal about China's role, while it's far less critical of India, that jumped from less than 2% of imports of its oil from Russia to more than 40%? Well, it's because India is a large democratic partner in containing China. So it doesn't matter what you actually do, as long as you are China that's deemed as adversary. That's bad for us. So this kind of price tag is baked in our expectations.
And just briefly before we get on to the liberal order, I want to follow with a question from YouTube about what happens if the shoe drops on the other foot, as it were, and the U.S.-China confrontation rises significantly, whether it's over Taiwan or over trade or something else. Where does Russia come in? How could China cash in and expect to receive some sort of assistance from Russia? What form would that take?
Weapon designs is already something that's fueling the Chinese military machine and has been fueling it for decades, but is also very helpful, number one. Number two, you have this line of commodities, including hydrocarbons, that are not coming over vulnerable maritime routes from Russia. Number three, you also have part of your supply chain, including military supply chain. So Russia and China are talking about building a drone factory in the Far East. That means that some of these drones may not be agricultural, and some of these supply chains is located inside Russia, so in deeply nuclear power state. And if Taiwan tries to knock out Chinese military-industrial complex, if they want to go after assets in Russia, that means bringing in another large nuclear power. And then finally, if the level of agreement between China and Russia is so deep that we don't understand yet, and that China wants to go on offensive in Taiwan, but then it asks Russia to do a big threatening military exercise around the Baltics, then the US attention is split and pulled away, because you have to think that this could be a serious contingency and put resources there to China's advantage.
And how about the liberal economic order? We've got a couple minutes left to talk about that. Who wants to answer that one?
Me? Okay. Okay. Does it have to be the liberal economic order? Because I think the problem is really bigger. I think I prefer the term rules-based international order. Let's call it liberal now for ease of, communication. I think it is under enormous pressure. The global power balance is clearly shifting east from west to east, also partly from north to south. Democracies are under pressure from the outside. So we discussed hybrid warfare, Russian hybrid warfare against now mainly European democracies, but also democracy in general. And they are fragile internally. And we are discussing all this in Berlin. And I said at the beginning, the political context here, the domestic context remains fragile, and it may become even more fragile. So we have to be very aware of this. So there are enormous challenges. And I think, domestic developments, so I think that the picture is mixed actually. So the overall trend and domestic developments in democracies, in many democracies today, actually favor autocratic developments or autocratic outcomes. At the same time, we see countries like Poland, for instance, that have gone full cycle with regard to right-wing populist government, or hopefully. Okay, we're still in the process, it's true. So I think I cannot really give an answer to that question, because I think it's an open-ended process. And this alone is a very strong assessment, I think, speaking from Berlin and from one of the capitals of the European Union, because indeed we're not talking about democracy in individual member states, we're also talking about the possible breakup of the European integration project as such if democracies in Europe at some point fail and nationalisms start to turn against one another. And I think this is by now, this is becoming a very tangible threat. Yeah, and this is where we are. It's existential and we have to take it seriously.
May I briefly?
Go for it.
Well, time is running up, but let me answer to Professor Masuo's question. She's leading Japan scholar on China, so I felt intimidated by her question on China. But well, Sasha saved me. But as of the question on the liberal economic order, I feel that liberal economic order, if there is something like that, is now ending, largely because of the spread of the ideology of state-controlled capitalist idea. Well, one of the reasons is that now Donald Trump is seriously damaging that order, like by demising the US aid Agency for International Development, because with that void of American aid to African countries, China is now trying to replace some of American role in increasing the amount of aid to African countries. And also China is trying to be closer to Latin American countries. If you combine the numbers of countries in Africa and Latin America, China can easily create a kind of a majority in the international community. And European Union member states with Japan, Canada, Australia, and so on. This will become minority international community. So if, number one, Russia would win in the current war, maybe not just Russia can increase the territory, but at the same time, Russia gains some kind of legitimacy of doing that. And also, with the continuation of the current Trump's policy towards Africa, towards South Africa as well, maybe that would further endanger the previous legitimacy or important norms in the international community. And the spread of Chinese aid, particularly of infrastructures to those countries, actually enhance their ability to control people. So the idea of Chinese state-controlled political economic system would be gaining momentum under the current situation. So as Japanese prime ministers have been saying, the result of the current war would be an important essential factor to define the future course of global politics.
And on that note, I believe we are out of time. So I'd like to thank again our panelists, you, our audience, and online on YouTube. I think this has been a very stimulating and wide-ranging discussion, not just about Russia, but about even and the war in Ukraine, but even more serious and potentially more destructive processes going on across the world right now. So if you could please give a hand for our panelists one more time, and thank you very much.